He shared a vape with a friend. His best friend stood right next to him and said no. Same party, same music, same couch. One of them went home with a headache. The other went home carrying an infection that would slowly destroy his right lung. 21 days later, Philip Garrido couldn't finish walking across a grocery store parking lot. A sharp pain ripped through the right side of his chest. He tried to take another breath. Nothing. It felt like someone had reached inside his chest and switched off half his lungs. He dropped his shopping bags. Then he dropped himself. By the time the ambulance reached him, his lips were turning blue. A CT scan showed something the emergency room doctors almost never see in a healthy 24-year-old. Part of his right lung wasn't just infected, it was dead. Minutes later, air began leaking through the holes the infection had carved into his lung. His right lung folded in on itself. The surgeons shoved a tube between his ribs to keep him alive. But here is the part that will keep you awake tonight. The collapsed lung wasn't the disease. It was the final symptom of a disease that had been silently destroying his lung for weeks. And no one had figured out how it started. This is Hidden Pathogens.
This is Hidden Pathogens?
Salt Lake City, Utah. Philip Garrido and Ken Slayton had lived 15 minutes apart for almost their entire lives. They met in 7th grade after Philip accidentally hit Ken in the face with a basketball during gym class. Philip thought he was about to get punched. Instead, Ken picked up the ball, laughed through a bloody nose, and said, "Next time, try aiming for the hoop." They'd been best friends ever since. Now they were 24. Philip worked as an HVAC technician. Ken was an apprentice electrician. Most weekdays started the same way. 5:30 in the morning, coffee from the same gas station. Breakfast burritos eaten in Philip's pickup before work. Whoever got there first paid. Nobody kept score. On weekends, they hiked the Wasatch Mountains, watched Utah Jazz games even when they knew the season was probably over, argued about movies, helped each other move apartments, helped each other's parents fix things around the house. If one of them got a flat tire, the other was already driving over before the tow truck was even called. Everyone assumed they'd still be friends when they were 80, but they had one argument that never ended. Ken hated sharing anything that touched someone else's mouth. Drinks, straws, forks, vapes. It wasn't because he thought everyone was dirty. He just believed some risks weren't worth taking. Philip never understood it. He was the opposite. If someone forgot lunch, Philip split his in half. If someone needed a charger, Philip tossed them his. If someone passed him a vape at a party, he took a puff and handed it back with a grin. To him, life was too short to worry about every little thing. That was why people loved him. He remembered birthdays without Facebook reminding him. He called his mom every Sunday. He volunteered every Thanksgiving at the community food drive because his grandfather used to tell him, "If you're lucky enough to have enough, make sure somebody else does too." People trusted Philip. People laughed harder when he was around, and Ken wouldn't have traded him for anyone. Remember that, because this isn't the story of a reckless man making a stupid decision. It's the story of a genuinely good man making one ordinary decision that millions of Americans make every weekend without thinking twice. 3 weeks before surgeons fought to save his lung, Philip got a text. "Birthday at Mason's place, Friday. Don't be late." Friday came faster than either of them expected. By 7 that evening, the driveway outside Mason Carter's house in Salt Lake City was already full. Pickup trucks, SUVs, music spilling through the open garage. Someone was standing over a grill. Someone else was arguing about which team would win the Super Bowl that year. It wasn't a wild party, just 20-somethings ending another work week together. Philip and Ken showed up carrying 2 boxes of pizza. Before they even reached the front door, someone shouted, "Finally!" The old married couple made it. Philip laughed. "Told you we'd be late because of you." Ken shook his head. "You stopped for ice cream. Worth it." Inside, the house buzzed with the kind of noise that only comes from people who have known each other for years. Friends from high school, co-workers, neighbors, people drifting from room to room with paper plates in one hand and drinks in the other. Philip knew almost everyone. If he didn't know your name, he'd remember your dogs. If you'd had a rough week, he'd ask how you were doing before talking about himself. That was just Philip. Around 9 o'clock, the music got louder. Someone dimmed the lights. A few people stepped out onto the back patio where the summer air finally felt cool enough to breathe. That's where someone pulled a vape from his pocket. It wasn't unusual. Nobody reacted. The device passed from one person to the next as casually as a bowl of potato chips. One puff, a laugh, another puff, another conversation. When it reached Ken, he waved it away. "I'm good." The others rolled their eyes. "Come on, man. One hit isn't going to kill you." Ken smiled. "I've heard that one before." He handed it back without touching it. The vape made its way around the circle. Then it reached Philip. He looked at Ken. Ken shrugged. Philip grinned. "Relax." He took one slow puff, coughed once. Everyone laughed. He laughed too. Then he handed the vape to the next person. The whole moment lasted less than 5 seconds. 5 seconds. No one looked sick. No one complained about the taste. No one noticed anything unusual. The conversation moved on. Someone turned the music up. Someone started another game of cornhole. Just after midnight, Philip and Ken climbed into Philip's truck. As they pulled away, Ken looked over and smiled. "You know? What? You always ignore my advice." Philip laughed. "And somehow, we're both still alive." Ken laughed too. Neither of them knew that, before the month was over, only one of those statements would still be true. Here is what happened inside Philip's body that night after the party. Nothing that he could feel. No fever, no cough, no pain. He woke up the next morning exactly the way he always did. 5:30, coffee from the same gas station. Ken was already leaning against Philip's pickup, holding 2 breakfast burritos. "You alive?" Ken asked. Philip stretched and yawned. "Barely. You sound terrible." "I sound like somebody who stayed up until 1 in the morning." Ken laughed. "Fair enough." They drove to work arguing about whether they should take a camping trip before summer ended. By Monday afternoon, Philip had completely forgotten about the vape. So had everyone else. Life kept moving. He crawled through attics fixing broken air conditioners, stopped by his parents' house after work to replace a leaking kitchen faucet, called his mom on Sunday like he always did. Nothing felt different. If there had been a clock counting down inside his chest. He couldn't hear it, but something had changed. Not because of the nicotine, not because of the vapor. Something microscopic had found a place to grow, deep inside the upper lobe of his right lung. At first, there were only a handful of bacteria, too few to block his breathing, too few to trigger a fever, too few for his immune system to recognize that something dangerous had arrived, so they multiplied. 1 became 10, 10 became 1,000, 1,000 became millions. With every passing hour, they spread farther through the tiny air sacs that carried oxygen into his blood. Philip breathed in. Philip breathed out. He laughed with his friends. He climbed ladders. He carried heavy toolboxes, completely unaware that every breath was feeding a battle he didn't even know had begun. A week after the party, he cleared his throat during breakfast. Just once. Ken looked over. "You getting sick?" Philip shrugged. "Probably allergies." He picked up his coffee, smiled, and took another sip. Neither of them knew that was the first symptom. Philip ignored the cough. At first, it only happened in the mornings. A few dry coughs, a sip of coffee. Then it disappeared. By lunchtime, he felt normal again. He spent the next few days installing air conditioning units across Salt Lake City in 90-degree heat, climbing ladders, hauling compressors, crawling through dusty attics. If anyone had asked how he felt, he would have said, "Fine," because he honestly believed he was. Then the fever started. It arrived on a Wednesday night. Philip woke up drenched in sweat. He kicked off the blanket and blamed the weather. By morning, the fever was gone. He went to work anyway. That afternoon, Ken noticed Philip sitting on the tailgate of his truck between jobs. "You taking a break?" Philip nodded. "Just tired." "You never sit down." "I didn't sleep much." Ken handed him a bottle of water. "You should probably see somebody." Philip twisted the cap open. "For a cough?" "You've had it over a week." Philip smiled. "My mom would be proud of you." "Your mom and I are on the same team." Philip laughed. "I'm not dying." Those words stayed with Ken, because less than 2 weeks later, he would hear doctors arguing about whether Philip was going to survive the night. By Friday, the cough had changed. It was deeper. He could feel it in the center of his chest. Every coughing fit ended with a sharp ache beneath his right shoulder blade. He still went to work, still joked with customers, still told everyone he was fine. Until Saturday morning. Philip walked up the stairs to his apartment carrying groceries. Halfway to the second floor, he stopped. Not because the bags were heavy, because he couldn't catch his breath. He stood there for nearly 30 seconds, one hand gripping the railing, the other pressed against his chest, waiting for his breathing to settle. It finally did. He told himself he was just out of shape. But Philip wasn't out of shape. He hiked mountains. He carried air conditioning units for a living. A single flight of stairs shouldn't have left him gasping. That afternoon, Ken showed up at Philip's apartment with takeout. The moment Philip opened the door, Ken frowned. "You look awful." "I've looked worse." "No." Ken stepped inside. "You actually don't." Philip tried to laugh. Instead, he doubled over coughing. The coughing fit lasted nearly a minute. When it finally stopped, Philip stared into the kitchen sink. There was a streak of bright red blood mixed with the mucus. He froze. Ken saw it too. Neither of them spoke. 5 hours later, they were sitting in the emergency department, and the doctors thought they already knew exactly what was wrong. The emergency department at the University of Utah Hospital was busy. Heart attacks, broken bones, a toddler with a high fever. Philip sat in the waiting room trying not to cough. Every deep breath felt like someone was pressing a fist into the right side of his chest. Ken sat beside him. Neither of them said much. After nearly an hour, a nurse called Philip's name. His temperature was 102.4 degrees. His heart was racing. His oxygen level had dropped to 91%. Lower than it should have been for a healthy 24-year-old. The nurse looked at the monitor. "Let's get you back." Within minutes, blood was drawn. An IV was started. A portable chest X-ray was rolled into the room. The emergency physician studied the image for less than 30 seconds. "There it is." He pointed to a large white patch in Philip's right lung. "That's pneumonia." Philip let out a slow breath. "So, good news," the doctor said. "We know what we're dealing with. Bacterial pneumonia is one of the most common reasons young adults end up in the hospital. Every year, hundreds of thousands of Americans are treated for it. Most recover completely. With the right antibiotics, patients usually begin feeling better within 48 to 72 hours. Philip looked over at Ken. Ken smiled for the first time that night. "You hear that?" Philip nodded. "Told you I wasn't dying." The doctor prescribed intravenous antibiotics, fluids, oxygen. He expected Philip to improve overnight. Everyone did, but while the medicine flowed into Philip's veins, something inside his right lung was already beyond saving. This wasn't an ordinary pneumonia. Ordinary pneumonia fills the tiny air sacs with infected fluid. The antibiotics kill the bacteria. The immune system clears away the damage. The lung heals. That isn't what was happening inside Philip. Some of the bacteria invading his lung had a far more destructive strategy. Instead of simply infecting the tissue, they were destroying it. Tiny sections of his right upper lung were beginning to die. Dead tissue has no blood supply, and without blood, the antibiotics couldn't reach every corner of the infection. So while everyone celebrated finding the answer, the real disease kept spreading. By the next morning, Philip's fever was even higher. His oxygen level was lower, and the white patch on his chest X-ray had gotten bigger. The emergency physician stared at the new results, then quietly picked up the phone. "I need pulmonology down here," because pneumonia was no longer explaining what they were seeing. The pulmonologist arrived just after sunrise. Dr. Melissa Carter had spent nearly 20 years treating lung disease. She looked at Philip for less than a minute before opening his chart. 24 years old, no chronic illness, no history of lung disease. Healthy enough to spend his days climbing ladders and carrying air conditioning units. None of it fit. She listened to his lungs. The right side sounded different, not just congested, quieter, as if part of the lung had simply stopped working. She ordered a CT scan immediately. Unlike an X-ray, which shows the lung as a flat image, a CT scan slices through the chest layer by layer. It lets doctors see what is actually happening inside the lung tissue. Philip was wheeled into the scanner. The machine hummed around him. 5 minutes later, the images appeared on the radiologist's screen. He scrolled once, twice, then stopped. "Can you come look at this?" Dr. Carter walked over. The room fell quiet. The white patch they had seen on the X-ray was still there. But now they could see what the X-ray had hidden. Dark holes. Several of them. They weren't supposed to be there. Healthy lung tissue looks like a sponge. These looked like someone had taken bites out of it. The radiologist zoomed in. One cavity, then another, each one surrounded by inflamed tissue. Dr. Carter didn't speak for several seconds. Finally, she said, "This isn't ordinary pneumonia." She ordered another round of blood cultures, more laboratory tests, a sputum sample. She wanted infectious disease involved immediately, because something aggressive was happening inside Philip's chest. Something was destroying pieces of his lung faster than his body could repair them. Outside the room, Ken watched nurses rush past carrying supplies. No one was smiling anymore. The confidence from the night before had disappeared. He caught Dr. Carter as she stepped into the hallway. "Is he going to be okay?" She hesitated. Just long enough for Ken to notice. "We're doing everything we can." It wasn't the answer he wanted. Inside Philip's room, the coughing had become almost constant. Every breath ended with pain. Every cough felt deeper than the last. Then, late that afternoon, he coughed into a tissue. This time, it wasn't just streaks of blood. It was enough to soak through the paper. A nurse looked at the tissue, looked back at Philip, then reached for the emergency call button, because whatever was happening inside his lung, it was getting worse by the hour. By the second night in the hospital, Philip could no longer walk to the bathroom without help. The oxygen tubing beneath his nose had become part of him. Every breath felt shallow. Every cough felt like sandpaper scraping across the inside of his chest. The antibiotics had been running for almost 24 hours. His fever hadn't broken. His blood tests looked worse. His oxygen needs kept climbing. Dr. Carter stood outside his room, reviewing the latest CT scan with the infectious disease specialist. "The cavities are larger," the specialist said. Dr. Carter nodded. "It's progressing faster than I expected." Neither doctor noticed Philip trying to sit up in bed. He wanted a drink of water. He reached for the cup on the bedside table. Halfway there, he froze. A sudden bolt of pain exploded through the right side of his chest. Not an ache, not pressure, a sharp, stabbing pain that stole the breath from his lungs. The plastic cup slipped from his hand. Water splashed across the floor. Philip opened his mouth to call for help. Nothing came out. He tried to inhale. His chest moved. His lungs didn't seem to. The monitor above his bed began to scream. His oxygen level, 92, 87, 82. The nurse looked up. "Philip?" His eyes were wide with panic. He grabbed at his chest with both hands. Every breath was shorter than the last. The nurse pressed the emergency button. Within seconds, the room filled with people, doctors, respiratory therapists, more nurses. High-flow oxygen. "Get another chest X-ray." Page Dr. Carter. Ken was standing just outside the room when he heard the alarms. He had stepped away only minutes earlier to call Philip's mother. Now he watched half the intensive care team rush past him. One nurse pulled the curtains shut. Another asked him to wait outside. He couldn't see Philip anymore, only shadows moving behind the curtain. Inside the room, Dr. Carter arrived carrying the portable X-ray film. She clipped it onto the light board. Everyone stared. The right lung looked different, much different. Instead of filling the entire right side of Philip's chest, it had folded inward, shrunken, compressed into a tight mass near the center of his chest. The space around it was black, not because it was empty, because it was full of air that didn't belong there. Dr. Carter didn't hesitate. He's got a pneumothorax, a collapsed lung. Somewhere inside Philip's damaged lung, the infection had destroyed so much tissue that it had torn open. With every breath, air leaked through the hole, not into his lung, but around it. Each breath trapped more air inside his chest. Each breath squeezed the lung smaller. Each breath made the next one harder. It was like trying to inflate a balloon while someone crushed it with both hands. "Chest tube," Dr. Carter ordered. "Now." There wasn't time for surgery. There wasn't time to explain. A nurse handed her the tray. Local anesthetic, scalpel, clamp, tube. Philip was still awake. He looked at Dr. Carter. "Am I?" He stopped to gasp for another breath. "Dying?" She held his hand for just a second. "We're not going to let that happen." Then she made a small incision between his ribs. Moments later, the tube slipped into his chest. A loud hiss filled the room. Air rushed out. The pressure around his lung began to fall. Slowly, very slowly, his oxygen levels started climbing again. 82, 86, 90. Outside the room, Ken slid down the wall and buried his face in his hands. Just yesterday, the doctors thought Philip had an ordinary case of pneumonia. Now, they were trying to keep him alive one breath at a time. But saving his collapsed lung still didn't answer the question that mattered most. Why had a healthy 24-year-old developed a pneumonia so aggressive that it literally destroyed his lung from the inside? Before we continue, if you're fascinated by real medical mysteries like this, share this video and subscribe to this channel. If you value these videos, there's a free link in the description and pinned comment that helps support the channel. Every bit of click helps us continue researching and telling these stories, and it's completely free. Let's continue. The chest tube saved Philip's life, but it didn't save his lung. The next morning, the air leak was still there. Every few seconds, tiny bubbles climbed through the collection chamber beside his bed, a steady reminder that somewhere inside his chest, air was still escaping from his lung. The antibiotics had been changed twice. His fever was lower, his oxygen was better, but the CT scan looked worse. The cavities had grown, more lung tissue had disappeared. Dr. Melissa Carter sat alone in the conference room with Philip's chart. She read it from the beginning. 24 years old, no asthma, no COPD, no diabetes, no immune disorder, no recent surgery, no hospitalization, no chronic illness. Healthy people don't usually develop this kind of pneumonia, and they almost never lose part of a lung because of it. Something was missing. She walked back into Philip's room, carrying only a notebook, not a stethoscope, not a prescription pad, just questions. Philip looked exhausted. His mother sat beside the bed, holding his hand. Ken stood quietly near the window. Dr. Carter pulled up a chair. "I know everyone has asked you a lot of questions already." Philip nodded. "I need to ask them again." She started from the beginning. "Have you traveled outside the country recently?" "No." "Any camping trips? Caves? Bad exposure?" "No." "Do you work around chemicals?" "I'm an HVAC technician." "Were you around anyone who was seriously sick?" Philip thought for a moment. "I don't think so." She kept writing. "Do you smoke?" "No." "Do you vape?" "No." She looked up. "You've never vaped?" Philip hesitated. The room went quiet. He glanced toward Ken. "I don't own one." Dr. Carter waited. "I took one hit off my friend's vape at a birthday party." "Only once?" Philip nodded. "It wasn't even mine." Ken spoke for the first time. I told him not to. Philip gave a tired smile. You've mentioned that a few times. No one laughed. Dr. Carter wrote something in her notebook. Then she asked another question. Did anyone else who used that vape get sick? Philip shrugged. I don't know. I haven't talked to most of them since the party. Dr. Carter closed the notebook. She didn't say, that's the answer, because it wasn't. Sharing the vape didn't prove what was making Philip sick. But it did tell her something important. Whatever this was, it hadn't started months ago. It had started recently. And it had started after one very specific night. Outside the room, she called the infectious disease specialist. I want every culture repeated. She paused. And I want the lab to identify exactly which bacteria we're dealing with. The specialist asked, You think we're treating the wrong infection? Dr. Carter looked through the glass at Philip. I think we're treating an infection, she said quietly, without understanding what it's capable of. 48 hours later, the laboratory called. The cultures had finally grown enough bacteria to identify the organism. And suddenly, everything about Philip's collapsing lung made sense. The call came just after 8 that morning. The microbiology laboratory had finally identified the bacteria growing from Philip's sputum and blood cultures. Dr. Carter thanked the technician, hung up the phone, and walked straight to the intensive care unit. She found Ken and Philip's mother waiting outside the room. Do you know what's causing this? Ken asked. She nodded. We do now. Inside the room, Philip looked stronger than he had the day before. The chest tube was still in place. The oxygen was still running, but his breathing was steadier. Dr. Carter pulled a chair beside the bed. You don't have an ordinary pneumonia. Philip looked at her. Then what do I have? You have something called necrotizing pneumonia. The room fell silent. Philip's mother frowned. I've never heard of that. Most people haven't, Dr. Carter replied. She picked up Philip's latest CT scan. This, she pointed to the dark holes scattered through the upper part of his right lung, shouldn't exist. She traced one of the cavities with her finger. When most people get pneumonia, bacteria infect the air sacs. The immune system attacks. Antibiotics kill the bacteria. The lung heals. She paused. That's not what happened to you. The bacteria inside Philip's lung weren't simply causing an infection, they were releasing toxins, powerful chemicals that attacked the lung itself. Instead of inflaming the tissue, they began killing it. Little by little, healthy lung became dead lung. Dead lung became empty spaces. Those empty spaces grew into cavities. Each cavity was a place where the lung could no longer exchange oxygen, no longer repair itself, no longer receive enough blood for antibiotics to penetrate effectively. The infection wasn't just surviving. It was creating places where it could hide. Dr. Carter changed to another CT image. This is why your fever kept getting worse. This is why the first antibiotics weren't enough. And this, she pointed toward the area where the chest tube entered Philip's side, is why your lung collapsed. Everyone looked at the scan. When enough tissue dies, it becomes fragile. It tears. The tear allows air to escape from the lung, but the air doesn't stay inside the lung. It leaks into the space around it. She drew a small circle on a notepad. Imagine a balloon inside a glass jar. The balloon is your lung. If you poke a hole in the balloon, the air escapes into the jar. The balloon can't stay inflated anymore. It shrinks. It collapses. That's exactly what happened inside your chest. Philip looked down at the tube coming from between his ribs. So, my lung didn't collapse because of the tube? No, the tube is the reason you're still breathing. Ken stared at the CT scan. So if he'd waited another day, Dr. Carter didn't answer immediately. Finally, she said, I don't think we'd be having this conversation. The room became quiet again. Philip looked toward the window. He remembered the birthday party, the music, the laughter, the vape passing from hand to hand. 5 seconds. That was all it had been. 5 ordinary seconds. He turned back to Dr. Carter. Can you fix it? She didn't lie. We can stop the bacteria. She looked at the damaged portion of his lung on the scan. But we can't bring dead lung tissue back to life. Philip swallowed hard. For the first time since he arrived at the hospital, he understood that surviving the infection didn't necessarily mean getting his old life back. And the hardest decision his doctors would make still hadn't been made. Finding the bacteria answered one question. It created another. The antibiotics were finally working. Philip's fever began to fall. His blood pressure stabilized. The bacteria were losing, but the damage they had already done wasn't. The chest tube continued to bubble. Every few seconds, another stream of air escaped from the hole inside his lung. Dr. Carter reviewed the newest CT scan with the thoracic surgery team. The infection had stopped spreading, but several large cavities remained. One of them had torn into the lining of the lung. That tear refused to close. A thoracic surgeon leaned back from the monitor. If the air leak doesn't seal itself, he paused, we're going to have to operate. Philip's mother looked at him. What kind of operation? The dead part of his lung has become a problem. He pointed to the largest cavity. Dead tissue can't heal. It can't fight infection, and it can't hold air. If we leave it there, the leak may never stop. Philip looked at Dr. Carter. What happens if you remove it? She answered honestly. You'll have less lung than you were born with. Will I still be able to work? We don't know. Will I still be able to hike? We don't know. Will I breathe normally again? Dr. Carter looked down for a moment. We hope so. Hope, not certainty. That was the best answer medicine could give. Outside the room, Ken sat alone in the hallway. He replayed that Friday night over and over. The music, the backyard, the laughter, the vape passing from one hand to another. He could still hear himself saying, just use your own. 5 words. That was all. He wondered how many times people ignored good advice simply because nothing bad had happened before. Philip's mother walked over and sat beside him. You can't blame yourself. I keep thinking. Ken stared at the floor. If I'd grabbed it before it got to him, she gently shook her head. If Philip could hear you, she smiled through tears, he'd tell you to stop being an idiot. For the first time in days, Ken laughed. So did she. Inside the intensive care unit, Philip looked out the window. For the first time since he was admitted, the mountains were visible again. Snow still covered the highest peaks above Salt Lake City. 3 weeks earlier, he had planned to hike those trails before summer ended. Now, walking to the hospital bathroom felt like climbing one of them. The following morning, the surgeons returned with new imaging. Everyone gathered around the monitor. No one spoke. Then Dr. Carter smiled. For the first time since Philip's lung collapsed, the hole is getting smaller. The antibiotics had stopped the infection. Philip's own body had finally begun repairing the tear. The surgery could wait. But even if the hole closed completely, the scars inside his lung would remain forever. Philip spent 12 days in the hospital. The first thing to disappear was the fever. Then the cough became less frequent. The blood stopped. His oxygen slowly returned to normal. One morning, Dr. Carter stood beside his bed with a smile Philip hadn't seen before. I think it's time. She reached for the tubing coming from his chest. The chest tube had been draining air for nearly a week. Now, the bubbling had stopped. The tear inside his lung had finally sealed. Take a deep breath, she said. Philip nodded. It still hurt, but not like before. Dr. Carter counted to 3. The tube slid free. A bandage covered the small incision between his ribs. For the first time since his lung collapsed. Nothing was attached to his chest. Philip looked down and smiled. So that's it? Dr. Carter smiled back. That's it. But she didn't leave. Instead, she pulled up a chair. I need to tell you what happens next. She opened his latest CT scan. The infection was gone. The cavities were no longer growing. The dead tissue had stopped spreading. But the images looked nothing like the lungs of a healthy 24-year-old. Where smooth, healthy lungs should have been, there were scars. Thick bands of scar tissue running through the upper part of his right lung. The body had repaired the damage. just not with new lung. Human lungs don't regenerate the way skin does. When enough lung tissue dies, the body patches the injury with scar tissue. Scar tissue is strong, but it doesn't breathe. It doesn't transfer oxygen. It simply fills the space where healthy lung used to be. Dr. Carter looked at Philip. The infection is over, but your lung won't ever be exactly the way it was before. Philip nodded slowly. He had expected those words. Hearing them still hurt. A week later, he walked out of the hospital beside Ken. The summer air felt different, not because the weather had changed, because Philip noticed every breath. The parking garage seemed farther away than he remembered. Halfway across the lot, he slowed down. Ken looked over. "You okay?" Philip smiled. Yeah, he wasn't lying. He just wasn't the same. Recovery didn't happen all at once. It happened in frustrating little pieces. The first walk around the block left him exhausted. Climbing a single flight of stairs meant stopping halfway to catch his breath. His pulmonologist enrolled him in pulmonary rehabilitation. Twice a week, he worked with respiratory therapists who taught him how to strengthen the healthy parts of his lungs. The exercises looked simple: walking, breathing, stretching. But after 20 minutes, his shirt would be soaked with sweat. The hardest part wasn't physical. It was accepting that his body had changed. 3 months after leaving the hospital, Philip drove to one of the trails overlooking the Wasatch Mountains. The same trail he and Ken had hiked almost every summer. Ken waited at the trailhead. "You sure about this?" Philip nodded. "I'm tired of wondering." The first mile wasn't bad. They laughed, talked about work, argued over which restaurant they should visit afterward. For a moment, everything felt normal again. Then the trail became steeper. Philip stopped, hands on his knees, trying to catch his breath. Ken pretended to study the view. He didn't say, "I told you we should turn around." He didn't say, "Take it easy." He simply stood beside his friend, waiting, just like Philip would have done for him. After a minute, Philip looked up. "I used to run up this hill." Ken smiled. "I remember." "I don't think I ever will again." Ken put a hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to." They reached the summit nearly 40 minutes later, much slower than they used to, but together. That evening, Philip called his mother. Just like he had every Sunday for years, she asked him the same question she had asked since he left the hospital. "How's your breathing?" Philip looked out the window before answering. "It's getting better." He smiled. "And today, I made it to the top." His lung would never be the same. His life would never be the same. But for the first time since that birthday party, he finally believed he still had one. 3 weeks. That's all it took. 3 weeks to turn a healthy 24-year-old into a patient with a collapsed lung. 3 weeks between a birthday party and an intensive care unit. Today, Philip Garrido is back at work in Salt Lake City. He still repairs air conditioners. He still meets Ken for coffee before sunrise. He still calls his mom every Sunday. Most people who meet him would never know what happened. They don't see the scar between his ribs where the chest tube saved his life. They don't hear the slight pause he takes after climbing a long flight of stairs. They don't know that part of his right lung will never work the way it once did. The bacteria are gone. The infection is gone. But the scars remain. Every future chest CT will tell the same story. A story written by an infection that only needed a few weeks to permanently change a healthy lung. This isn't about living in fear. Millions of people use e-cigarettes every day. Millions share drinks, food, and vapes with friends without ever becoming seriously ill. Most never experience anything like Philip did. But severe bacterial pneumonia can happen, and when it becomes necrotizing pneumonia, it can destroy lung tissue so quickly that even the right antibiotics can't reverse damage that's already been done. That's why a cough that keeps getting worse, a fever that won't break, chest pain, shortness of breath, or coughing up blood should never be ignored. Because by the time Philip's lung collapsed, the infection had already been destroying it for days. And here's the part doctors hope you'll remember. Antibiotics can kill bacteria. They cannot bring dead lung tissue back to life. He shared a vape with a friend. His best friend stood right next to him and said no. Same party, same music, same backyard. One of them woke up with a headache. The other woke up carrying an infection that would slowly destroy his right lung. 21 days later, doctors pushed a tube between his ribs as his lung collapsed inside his chest. That was the only difference. That was the entire difference. If you made it all the way to the end, thank you. These stories take a lot of research to put together. If you'd like to support the channel, you'll find a free link in the description and pinned comment. Checking it out helps support future videos, and every click allows us to keep bringing these cases to the channel. Also, it's completely free. If you learned something from this case, like, share, and subscribe for more real medical stories. And if you chose not to subscribe, leave a comment and tell me what would make these videos better. I read far more comments than you might think. This is Hidden Pathogens. I'll see you in the next video. Good night.
This is Hidden Pathogens.